This is the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, a podcast brought to you by two physical therapists devoted to helping physical therapists and other healthcare providers become better educators to patients, students, the community, and each other by interviewing prominent and passionate people within the realms of healthcare and education. The Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast is intended literally for educational and entertainment purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based on only one source, and therefore this podcast should not be used as personal medical advice. While care has been taken to ensure accuracy, occasionally mistakes and factual errors can be present, as we are only human. This is our journey on the road to becoming better educators, so get ready with your pen and paper as class is about to begin. Welcome back, everyone, to the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast. I'm Brandon, and of course, I'm always joined by F. Scott Field. And today we have a really special guest brought to you from the University of Saskatchewan. And today we have the one and only leader from the Strength Rebel Alliance, I'll add, Dr. Scotty Butcher. Now, for those who don't know who he is, Scotty Butcher is an associate professor of physical therapy at the University of Saskatchewan with research focusing on strength training and high-intensity interval training using traditional and multimodal methodology in a variety of clinical and healthy populations. He is also the co-founder and co-owner of Strength Rebels, providing health and fitness professionals educational seminars, courses, and resources for strength and high-intensity interval training methodology. Now, first of all, Dr. Scotty, thank you so much for coming on, and I can't tell you how happy we are and thrilled we are to have you on. I know I kept your bio relatively brief, but was there anything that I left out of there that you'd like our audience to know about you before we start?
No, you went through my whole CV, so yeah, I think I'm pretty good. But what I do want to say is thanks for inviting me to come on, guys. I'm super happy to be able to come on and talk with you guys. You guys are doing some good stuff.
Yeah, thanks, man. I have I guess it's kind of a random question regarding our neighbors just north of the border there. What, is it possible, right? Have you had any students come through that have gone on to practice in the United States, or vice versa, that you've seen some students from the U.S. come and practice in Canada? And if so, what is that process like? Do you know, what it entails to get licensed up in Canada?
Well, yeah, it's we've seen. I've met a few U.S. Grads that have come up here, but I want to say that's before the implementation of the DPT. So we're talking obviously a few years ago. There's definitely a lot of students that will graduate from our programs and then come down to the States. That's for sure. And then so they would basically have to undergo your licensing process and that. So the process up here is relatively simple, which is I think similar to you guys, but we have a nationwide national exam. I believe you guys have state exams. Is that correct?
Well, ours is a national exam, but the laws vary by state. So yeah, same exam no matter what state you're in, but then each state has different processes for getting your license in it.
Right. Well, I guess that'd be fairly similar to what you've got up here. So we've got our national exam that anybody coming out of a physical therapy program would write. Now, if you're coming from the States, usually most programs are relatively well known to the alliance up here that regulates that. So it's the process of getting the program that you've graduated from and your credentials authenticated and basically determined to be equivalent or close to the type of education that we would get is relatively simple. I mean, it's a bit different if you're coming from a country that's, say, overseas or something like that. But so there's a bit of a residency period, and then they write their exam, and they become a resident until they can pass their practical exam. So there's a written and a practical component, of course, and then then they can get their full license.
Interesting. No, that's very interesting. And especially with, I don't know if you've heard, Dr. Scotty, with the new issue that they're bringing up now with the APTA here in the U.S., the Clinical Education Task Force is thinking about making some pretty big changes to the way clinical education, DPT education is structured down here. And I don't know. I mean, I know we've talked with that a few guests, and it's very interesting. And I'm just kind of curious. Have you heard kind of that task force and kind of what's going on?
Just peripherally. I haven't paid too much attention just because I've got a few other things going on, and obviously doesn't necessarily affect directly what we're doing. And is it, we have our qualification that would call someone a physical therapy resident. It's not through a formal residency like you guys have. We once they pass the exam, they have a period of time before they actually can get some to get their credentialing. So our students can come out of their PT program, and up here they're all MPTs. So they can come out of their MPT program and work with a supervised license, but it's not a formal residency. It's just a sort of a supervisor type agreement, and so there's no real specialty format that we would go through until you're very much post grad, and our specialization's a bit later. So it's different enough that I haven't been paying too much attention, to be honest.
Scotty, could you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming a PhD? Could you tell us that process?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't mind doing that at all. So pretty much like anyone else coming out of high school and getting into university and thinking about professions and that, I was into a lot of sports and had obviously a lot of injuries and saw PT and sort of fell in love with the idea of being a PT, and but of course I came into school wanting to be a sports physical therapist and work primarily orthopedics, and that was the where it basically started, and that took me through right into my first job in orthopedics, and I did a lot of sports coverage, and what I ended up doing within about 3 years of graduating is I went and did a master's degree in an area. It was on core stability at the time, and core stability in athletes. And the reason I did it was not necessarily from a research perspective, but to gain a clinical knowledge. And so this is actually when I graduated. This is how old I am. Is that it was actually a bachelor's program of physical therapy that I graduated from. So it wasn't even the MPT, let alone the DPT. But so went on to do a clinical master's, which was a research-based master's, but I did it for clinical reasons, and then took a job in sports. Then had this weird little twist in life where I ended up moving, and because I was getting engaged to my wife at the time, and I moved back home here to Saskatoon, and took something that was took a job that was completely outside of my realm of what I thought then my expertise, and it was in pulmonary rehab, and I was doing exercise program design for the organization that I was working for in sports prior to that. And so for me, this was, a program management position. It was as well implementing direct exercise programs for patients with different lung diseases. And so there was a close enough fit to what I wanted that I took it on, but I never really expected it to go anywhere, to be honest. But honestly, I fell in love with working with older adults, and I fell in love with the idea of improving and enhancing rehab based on the models that were out there that I had obviously looked into as I was taking this job. And so I worked there for about 3 years and decided to go do a PhD in Edmonton, where the Oilers play, and did a combination of strength and conditioning, exercise physiology, and pulmonary medicine, which is one of the weirdest combinations you can probably do. And so finished my PhD and came back home here to Saskatoon, and I've been working here ever since. And my research career has really started off with looking at the good quality testing and training practices in patients with lung disease, but I've since branched off and have done quite a bit on older adults in general, and then clinical populations and some other side work on biomechanics and things like that. So anyway, that's the long-winded version.
No, that's interesting, man. And I'm kind of curious, Dr. Scotty, based on the research that you've kind of done now regarding those things, what's some of the biggest lessons or things that you're learning that you're like, whoa, I never would have thought that? Or what are some of the big things that you've learned as a result of kind of the recent research that you've done?
Yeah, well, there's tons. I mean, if you're not learning, you're sort of fading away, right? So, I mean, anytime you go and read a research article, you think about the process of EBP and how it all fits into the big scheme of things. So I'm always looking for ways to change. And the biggest, I'd say there's two big things. One would be in the area of chronic disease in older adults, and my current focus, which it wasn't always this way, is really to think about the importance and the development of whole body strength in these populations, and what that can do compared with what we typically would do in rehab, which would be much more of an aerobic model, a lower intensity training model, which is quite limited after at least the first 4 to 6 weeks of getting someone off the couch. So I'd say that's probably the biggest thing, and that revelation there in terms of me doing that and coming to that conclusion has really directed where I've been going. But I'd say that's probably the biggest one. And then another side one that I'd throw in there too is the importance of the core stability, because of course as I said, I did my master's in core stability, and not to say that the core, however you want to define it, isn't important necessarily, but it's I think we go about it and the way we look at it in a way that's very outdated often, and I think we've taken some of that original research of Hodges and Richardson and really twisted it, which is what everybody's done. And so I think we've kind of come to that realization that maybe we can't affect the 0.5 milliseconds of delay in the transverse abdominis with our basic hollowing exercises. And it kind of sounds a little silly now, but that's certainly the way we thought back then. So I'd say those are the two biggest things.
Wow. Yeah, Scotty, you hit a lot of really good points there, and I want to try to touch on all of them, but let's kind of work from the front to the back here and look at, you basically brought up a good point about whole body strengthening, right? One of the things that we wanted to talk about tonight or this morning was basically, why aren't physical therapy programs incorporating enough full body strengthening type education in their programs? Like, you do a really good job of incorporating it into your classroom, right? Why isn't that just standard run of the mill stuff? Like, what, how do you go about incorporating it versus what, why should other programs kind of jump on board with you?
Yeah, awesome question. So, for your first part of your question was, well, why isn't it happening? And it isn't happening because, not because of lack of intention of the professors or the profession itself to look at good quality training. I think we always we want to do the best that we can, but I think it's a lack of experience in the methodology that you would take to become a good strength coach. And I mean, realistically, that's how I look at training our physical therapists, is as clinical strength coaches. So not sport related strength coaches, but clinical strength coaches, which to me has a very different ring to it. But I could talk about that in a bit. But to get at your question, the reason is that people aren't doing it. Right. It's not getting done because people aren't doing it. And I think that this is going to change because of that. I mean, obviously you can see through probably the last 4 or 5 years, you really see a big push on anybody that you talk to, either social media wise or in conferences, and where people are really starting to realize that, there's good quality training, and then there's training that is much more of the traditional therapeutic exercise sort of approach. And people are realizing that you don't necessarily have to completely isolate a muscle or a particular movement pattern to get gains in function and promote healing with whatever's going on with this isolation-based approach. And what you can do is people are seeing that you can actually achieve a greater overall physiological and movement-based functional change with whole body strengthening, and you still get at the therapeutic stuff, and you can kind of do an incorporation there. I guess the way that I look at it, and probably one of the, to get a little bit more to your second part of your question, was more on how do you actually do this, and what is it going to take to change. The first part of that is that it would take experience. So I think what you need is this big push that's out there where people are realizing this, and clinicians are actually incorporating these things, and they're finding not only does healing improve, do the conditions improve, but they actually get some whole body functional improvement, right? Similar to an athlete, right? And so the way I describe it is that, most of the research on pain and recovery in almost every condition indicates that there's not a lot of difference between the different type of exercises you can do, right? So using low back pain as a primary example, the research is very equivocal, and it says, it doesn't matter if you're walking, if you're running, if you're doing isolated strength training, you're doing core stability training, you're doing anything, you get similar type responses to from a pain and a function perspective. So in essence, it doesn't necessarily matter from a recovery perspective. But then if we think of, how we would train these people from a task perspective and say, hey, I want to get them to be better at climbing stairs, or I want them to be better at lifting without developing either, whatever poor mechanics are, or I want to improve their ability to do that without getting injured, or whatever it is. Walking isn't going to necessarily cut it. Teaching them how to lift with good technique and building up strength that way is going to hit at a wide variety of functional change that you don't get with some of the isolation approaches or some of the more aerobic approaches. So again,
if you're a professor that's not doing this stuff, essentially you're really just kind of making excuses then, right? Because I took therapeutic exercise as a class, and it was very isolationist, but we didn't do any of the stuff that I see a lot of your students doing. So could you walk us through like maybe one of your classes? Like what do you do specifically? What do you show them? What do you have them go through?
Yeah. So I do talk about. I think I'd be remiss to not mention the traditional therapeutic exercise stuff and say that it is an option, because certainly I'm not saying that you never do isolation work. And some people do take that because I'm such a movement-based strength guy that people say that I would suggest you never do the isolation stuff. And in any training program, there's a time and a place for that, right? So even in an athlete's training program, or, you look at bodybuilders particularly, they focus on, or they should be focusing on the major lifts. But then isolation work is what targets where they want to get at. So I get the whole idea of targeting. So I do talk to them about the, how to integrate some of their kinesiology based knowledge and the arthrokinematics and the anatomy, functional and applied anatomy, in terms of how you would do that for isolation approach. So I do that as well, but I also break it into more of a regional and a global approach, so that you have a wide range of options that you can go. But then what I also talk about is how there's quite a bit of research in, particularly you look at the shoulders, there's quite a bit suggesting that it doesn't really matter which exercise you choose, you're still going to get the rotator cuff in there. So do you really need to isolate the rotator cuff muscles in order to do some rotator cuff training, right? So I'll talk about the concepts around that, and how you can strengthen a particular muscle or stretch a particular muscle, but that's not necessarily going to improve their mobility or their actual movement patterns. So you actually have to get them training through something whole body to get these whole body improvements. So I start off really with that approach, and then once they kind of get a sense of it, I usually get maybe about half of them buying into it after about that point, and I get the other half later, by the way, but the first half is usually bought in, and they bring everybody else in for the most part later. But then it's a matter of doing. It's a matter of getting out and saying, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to teach you the pattern of a hip hinge and how that turns into a deadlift and how that can turn into a kettlebell swing and how that relates to squatting. And then we'll teach you how to squat, and we'll look at your individual squatting responses and how each of your clients are going to have different width and turnout of their feet, and how the depth is going to be limited by probably their hips, not necessarily that their knees are going past their toes, and then it's all of that's okay. And so we go through the point of teaching, and so hip hinging deep squatting, and then overhead movement, looking at what the mobility is overhead, and kind of getting them to the point where they can look at scapular mechanics and shoulder mechanics from a very general perspective, rather than the nitpicky little, or is there a subtle little asymmetry, and say that, let's just get people pressing and pulling and deadlifting and squatting. And so I teach them how to do that themselves, because a lot of them, if they've had exercise phys background, or if they've had a lot of training background, they may not have the type of techniques that I would typically teach. So I teach them my method, and then they do, and they practice. And what I do in our advanced exercise prescription labs is I actually have a competency checklist. So they have to, for those that have the mobility, and those that have don't have a disability that would prevent them from doing the full movements, they have to show me their version of the full movement. And that means they may have other issues, may have injuries, and they need to work around those, just like they would with a client, to say, okay, well, how are you going to do this for you, which would be how you do it for a client. So it might be restricting depth. It might be, changing the movement a little bit. It might be changing the foot position. It may be, completely changing the exercise because of whatever disability they have. So I think the big thing and the big take home message is that in order for students to learn how to incorporate this into their practice, they really have to see the benefit of it and see that they can do it. Because honestly, like I said, there's about half of them that don't buy into it at the beginning. And out of the half that do, maybe half of them are good movers, and they still need some practice in terms of doing this. So once they get to the point where they can all do the exercises and understand how the basic mechanics works, then they practice, and they do it on themselves, and they coach each other, and they try it out on volunteer patients, and then it's not going to make them into a full-blown strength coach at the level of entry. There's lots of work that continuing ed that they'd have to do, and lots of practice that you're going to have to do in this, of course, because you can't just take a course in being a strength coach and expect to be a good quality strength coach, right? But at least they get the basic movements down, and what most of them recognize is that A, it's feasible to do in any population. This isn't just for athletes, and B, that they can do it, and that they can actually go through this process and figure it out. So for a lot of them, it's very eye-opening to go through the process of learning how to do these movements and say, hey, you know what, I never thought I could ever do that. And look, here I'm doing it, and I can actually teach someone how to do it, and I have the competency to understand what it feels like so that I can teach it to someone else.
Yeah, I absolutely love that approach. I think that's fantastic, going through each kind of movement and kind of how they build off each other. And I especially really like the idea that even if someone's got a particular issue and they have to work around it, because I think that's clutch, for them being able to experience and adapt and feel how the movement goes, they're going to be so much better at explaining that to a client when they're working with. And that's a good layout for that. And I know you said before, kind of working on, the strength and conditioning stuff, but is that like with the kind of the stuff that's on the strength and conditioning exam, is that stuff that you incorporate through your educational materials and your didactic work?
So you're talking the CSCS?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have a lot of mixed feelings about the CSS, to be honest. I think it's a good starting point for people that don't have a lot of background in strength and conditioning. And, certain things about the reps and sets and that, I mean, they're very NSCA specific, and that's fine. But they have their model that is very much based on the U.S. athletic, collegiate athletic model, right? I mean, that's I would say one of the biggest ways that they approach that. And I don't know if that's necessarily the best model for clients. And I guess I'm saying that a bit mildly. I probably would say that it's not the best model for clients in therapy. I think when you look at an athlete, there's very specific needs that they would have relative to their sport, but they're also at a much higher level to begin with. And so I think what it would be missing in looking at our strength and conditioning practices in therapy, like our clinical strength practices, is the fact that we might be dealing with someone who's active, but we're certainly not dealing with an elite level athlete who has a significant strength base and potentially a movement base to them. So we have to back way up from that. And I think we have to back up to a stage before really where the NSCA and the CSCS is really teaching people to do. So there's the NSCA and the CSCS does a lot on periodization and very specific rep ranges and loading ranges for different adaptations, and that can be useful for athletes, but certainly not for the general population, where I think you need a much more specific strength-based approach that would be much more like Bill Starr, the 5x5 or starting strength, or the West Side method and things along those lines that are much more whole body strength as the main focus of what they do, rather than going off and doing a lot of periodization type things. I think power is developed through strength, but you need that strength as a base, and you're not going to get that with honestly doing low load fast velocity training in a clinical population that's much more designed for athletes.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense actually. And kind of going back to, I know Scott asked a while back about incorporating this into a program, but say I'm a professor or an assistant professor, new professor, and I've got a little bit of some strength background, and my program that I'm at for some reason does not do a lot of incorporation into this, and I want to change that. How would you recommend, is the best way to go about, approaching the higher ups and even your colleagues to kind of help facilitate something like that?
Yeah, good question. That described me to a T when I started. To be honest, I had a lot of education on obviously I'd finished a PhD, and I did do the CSCS, and I did ACSM certification and that. So when I started as a professor, I felt, hey, I've got a pretty good amount of knowledge when it comes to training and exercise, and I certainly had a lot of personal experience with training as well. But to be honest, what ended up happening was, and it was sort of a bit of a fluke, because I was kind of going down a different path when I first started relative to the way that I taught, students. What the eye-opening part for me was when I actually met, through one of my students, I met a strength coach, a local strength coach, who was coaching CrossFit. He was coaching Olympic lifting and powerlifting, and was getting into strongman and a lot of the strength sports. And so I started training under him, and he ended up being my co-founder of Strength Rebels. So this is Chad Benko I'm talking about. So what ended up happening was I met him and started training, and realized how much I didn't know. And realize that, wow, when you actually incorporate some good quality deadlifting and squatting patterns, how much that fix all the niggling aches and pains, much more so than, some of the other stuff I was doing, and my mobility was improving and all that. So it was an eye-opening moment for me. I actually came into the strength game fairly late in my career. I was already a professor. So this would be someone who, that you're talking about, that would be very similar, that maybe has a little bit of a background but wants to know more. The biggest challenge, and I think the biggest thing, is really to buy into what this can do for you. And so and this is the same advice that I give to any graduating student coming in that wants to get into this, or a professor, or anybody that wants to get in this. You have to go train. You have to go get in a gym. You have to partner with a strength coach, or at least this is one of the better ways to go about doing it. It doesn't mean you have to, but I would recommend that you go find a strength coach that knows what he's talking about and has a good reputation, and go and train under him and learn. And then if you felt you've learned enough, then go see someone else or keep training, and then bring it in. And I had to fight, to be honest, against the conventional model. And we just moved into a new facility about a year ago. And so in the planning of that facility, because I taught the exercise content, I was asked by the planning people, which were all physios that are within our department, well, what kind of equipment you need. And honestly, I had to fight to get a squat rack. I had to fight to get a deadlift platform. I had to fight to get dumbbells heavier than 10 to 12 pounds. There were I had to fight to get a trap bar, a safety squat bar, all of these things. And eventually it's just a matter of, if I believe in it, that I kept pushing, and then we were able to get these pieces of equipment, and we're better off for it, because we have the opportunity now to do all these things in-house, so it's not an easy road, especially when you have people that are a bit more of what we'd call the old, or what I'd call old school, where they're they're old school physios that wonder why, when someone never has to lift heavy in their daily life, why would you get them to lift heavy? And I mean, the answer is around efficiency, and the answer is around functional reserve, and the answer is in the training process itself. So once you buy that, once you get that, I think it's it's just a matter of keeping pushing and that. So hopefully that it's not a concrete answer as the ins and outs of how do you get people to buy in, but I mean, the first thing is understanding it yourself, and then once you do that, I think everything comes.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great take and good advice on that. And I'm sure, of course, it's variable depending on the program and such as well. And, I'm kind of curious, Dr. Scotty, why do you feel that overall there is such a resistance to incorporating something like that overall across the boards within these programs?
So it's a good question. One is a lack of experience with training. I think that's really number one. The other thing, though, is if you look at where most programs that I've had exposure to, where they get their exercise information from, and a lot of it comes from, let's say, the ACSM as an example. Sometimes in the NSCA, if depending on the program, but the ACSM has very traditionally been an aerobic-based organization, and this goes back to the days of the Cooper Lab, Kenneth Cooper, and the aerobic model, and looking at the really good quality studies that were starting to come out even in the 70s and 80s, looking at the importance of the aerobic type exercise in health. And at the same time as that, there's also the bodybuilding movement where people were starting to look at bodybuilders as, oh, maybe these could be ways for us to train, but what they would do is they would look at the isolation methods and say that, well, these are the advanced techniques. So I think we're looking for things that challenge our patients, but I think somewhere we missed the boat on looking at these whole body movements. So I think it's a combination of the aerobic movement starting in the 70s and the traditional isolation based approach that has never really been challenged until recently. So honestly, I think the resistance comes from the fact that we just haven't been doing it yet. So as more clinicians do it, as more students are advocating for it, I think we're in for change. I think this is going to happen. It's just a matter of people figuring out the ins and outs of how to actually do this and how to incorporate it in, and what we need. And a colleague of mine up here in Canada just I shared a memory on Facebook a while back from him, that he said, if we're the movement and exercise experts as physical therapists, then why don't we have our own exercise guidelines? Why are we borrowing from everybody else's guidelines? And I thought it was amazingly insightful, that comment, that, yeah, you know what, we need our own guidelines. We need some work out there, some information, whether it be textbooks or articles or reviews or something that says, well, how do you do this? How do you actually put these strength training principles into practice for clinical settings? And right now, there isn't a good resource out there.
Yeah, Scotty, you bring up a good point. I think, I kind of follow your path more closely than I thought. I think I'm working on my educational doctorate as we speak, and all I've got left is my dissertation, and I haven't lifted weights for about 10 years. It was probably grad school was the last time I lifted weights. So this year I decided, all right, if I'm a physical therapist, I need to be able to talk the talk and walk the walk, so to speak, right? So I started lifting again with Mike Eisenhardt's Summer a Move, and it's made some drastic differences just in how I feel and the physiology behind, my daily movements, and I love it. It feels great, but I definitely feel like that's just a starting point for me, and I need to learn more. I saw recently that you had completed the CrossFit Level 1 certification. Can you talk about that a little bit? Is that something that physical therapists should look into, whether they're CrossFit minded or not?
Good question. So, you look at what resources are out there that you can learn from. And I think, as I mentioned before, the strength coaches, the ones that are in the strength sports are really a good start. CrossFit being one of them. And I know there's lots of controversy. I think it's, people are, as CrossFit stays around and is showing some massive benefits to people, I think people are starting to realize that CrossFit isn't necessarily, as bad as what some other organizations certifications would make it sound. I like CrossFit. I think it's got it's a really neat study in physiology, to be honest. It's, you can't pigeonhole it to, even in an individual WOD, you can't pigeonhole into aerobic or anaerobic or strength or power. It's a combination of everything. And I think we don't know enough about the methodology, but what we do know is it works. And this is the key message to answer your question, is that, we see with CrossFit, we see some massive changes in people from their physical capacities. And often that's just, an example of good quality training, but a lot of their training methods fly in the face of traditional guidelines. Like you look at the way just to use this as an example, the NSCA and their CSCS guidelines, in terms of having specific rep ranges and having specific ways that you would periodize your programs potentially. CrossFit flies in the face of that, but yet they're producing, high level world class athletes that are, that are able to compete in all of the other strength sports, and that it provides a very good foundation. So I guess my view on the certification is similar to my view on CrossFit itself, is that there's a lot that you can learn from that. We don't know enough, I think, in terms of what it means. But the one thing that is very good about their certification is that they actually take you through the movements, and you actually have to perform the movements. And there's not many other certifications, starting strength being one of them. But there aren't many other ones out there where you actually have to show some level of competency in moving and analyzing other people's movement. So, this is one of the downfalls, I think, of the CSCS, is that, the practical is definitely not that. So I think if you're looking to develop some skill in coaching, there's some very good things you can take from that.
Awesome. All right, I got one question from left field. I've got a 6-year-old daughter. We have just started watching Star Wars for the first time. Started her out with episode 4, 5, and 6.
Okay, good.
All right. And that's where we're at right now. We're not going to go much further than that just yet. We're going to try to take it all in, maybe rewatch them again. I'm not sure yet. So, favorite Star Wars villain? Go.
Oh, man. Vader, obviously. That's the obvious answer, but, really, it's Vader. Classic, right?
Yeah, definitely. Ironically enough, that's her favorite character as of right now.
Well,
so I'm a little concerned, but she says she loves his music, so I'm okay with that. Yeah, it's interesting to kind of see, some of the new stuff that's coming out. I like a lot more than I thought I would. I'm really excited to see how it wraps up. And then I'm not sure. After the original 3, I'm not sure which direction I want to head with her. So we'll see. Yet to be determined.
Here's what I would do with someone who is jumping right into the Star Wars. You go, I think the very first one you watch is Rogue One. And the reason for that is that it's a new movie with new technology that, someone that's getting into it now doesn't have to see all the cheesy stuff of the 4, 5, 6 and think these are terrible movies without really understanding what the movies are about. So you get them to see Rogue One first, then you go 4 and 5, and then I'm sort of 50-50 on the machete order. So the machete order is you go 4, 5, and then you use 2 and 3 and potentially 1 if you can tolerate Jar Jar as a
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one, right? So often I'll say skip 1, but then you miss out on Mace Windu and you miss out on Darth Maul. And so, I don't know, there's like I said, 50-50 on that. But then you use those as a flashback right after the reveal in Empire of, Vader being Luke's dad, and then you get the backstory, and then you jump to 6, right? And then you can go 7 and beyond from there. So that'd be my recommendation.
Awesome.
Man, nothing like Star Wars. Love it. And I'm curious, Dr. Scotty, what are your thoughts on? I don't know if you've seen a lot of the theories that are coming out about episode.
I've read them all, man.
Man, what are your thoughts on kind of how, in terms of some of the big stuff that they talked about? Like who Snoke is, what's going to happen. I'm just curious, kind of what you think on that one.
Yeah, good question. I think there's a lot of mystery right now that will get wrapped up, obviously with the trilogy. And I really like the idea that, I know some people are against it, but that JJ's coming back for 9. And, I thought he did a great job with, Force Awakens. So I'm super excited to have him back for the final one. There'll be some interesting twists that I don't think we know about. I think they probably, everybody's speculated on every potential possible thing that could be happening and the way people are related and who's parents and who's a Sith or who's a Jedi and all of this stuff. And I'm just excited for the process to see how it all plays out, because I think there's going to be some interesting twists and what maybe we've heard of them before, but what they end up choosing will be what it is. And I'm just excited for the process and to sit back and be a kid listening to their dad tell a story. Basically, these things are so exciting for me.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it's interesting too, like when you look back at Rogue One's trailer, like it first came out, and then you look at the actual movie, you're like, wait, that wasn't in there.
Yeah, they do that a lot. Well, they did that. I mean, they've always done that, right? You take some pre-production stuff and you kind of guess as to what's going to be in there, what are going to draw people in. But yeah, it's all good. Once you see the movie, and even the terrible movies are still Star Wars. And if you're a fan, you're a fan. You can tolerate one because you take the good with the bad, and you tolerate Jar Jar so that you get to see Mace Windu and you get to see Darth Maul and you get to see Qui-Gon and that. So, even though the movie itself may be terrible, it's still a Star Wars story. And I actually love the cartoons for that reason too, is, I watch with my kids, I watch the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels and there's some of the stories are really cool and some of them are just, like neat little kid stories, but, they do add to the mythos of it and they add to the mystique as well. So I think it's all good.
Yeah, cool. And, we kind of like to wrap up each episode with kind of one question here. So, Dr. Scotty, if you could change one aspect of physical therapy education, what aspect would you change and how would you recommend changing it?
Good question. So, I mean, obviously we've talked a lot about my biases towards strength and sort of the whole body strength approach and that, and I certainly say that's near the top of the list. But I think there's a bigger underlying approach that we tend to avoid, and I almost say avoid on purpose, that we tend to focus on very short-term gains in our education and teaching our students how to be therapists, and they think about short wins, little wins of how quickly can I get them recovering and things like that. But I think what we really miss out on is we miss out on the longer term approach, and we know that in most situations injuries heal, people start to get better, people, if they can get off the couch, they improve strength and endurance, and but these are all short-term things. And I think where we miss the boat is we miss looking at the client as a lifelong client rather than a client just for this particular time in their life. And so I would like to see therapy become a lifelong type approach where we do see clients over and over again, even, I know it's controversial, but even as the yearly exam kind of example. But, if we can look at the big picture and say, take someone when they're 40 with some knee pain or injury and think about what is this person going to look like when they're 80 and they can't get off the toilet. So, I think there's a lot of prep that we can do by thinking longer term than we do. So I'd say that's the biggest thing, is we've got to think beyond the 6 weeks in the clinic.
Awesome. Scotty, thanks so much for coming on to talk with us today. We really enjoyed it. Could you tell our audience where they can find you online and on social media?
Yeah, so Facebook and Twitter, Dr. Scotty Butcher on Facebook, and Twitter is at Inked Prof Scotty. So those are probably the two best places. And then I have Strength Rebels, and we are also on Twitter and Instagram at Strength_Rebels. And the other thing would be to find us on YouTube. We've got a huge free resource of different exercises and our assessment and teaching approach that I would teach my students. Most of it's online for free.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and your insight, Dr. Scotty. It was a pleasure to have you on.
It was certainly a pleasure to be on. You guys asked some good questions, and you guys are doing some good work. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for attending class today, and we hope that you learned something and gained value from the content.
If you'd like to schedule office hours with us, feel free to add us on Twitter at HET Podcast, on Instagram, HET Podcast, on Facebook, the Healthcare Education Transformation Podcast, and the homepage, healthcareeducationtransformationpodcast.com.
And for those of you following along in the syllabus, extra credit can be obtained by liking us, sharing us, and leaving a review.
Let's continue our journey up Mount Educational Success as lifelong learners.